Hey, thanks for the reply video. You're right. There's a lot to cover in 10 minutes, but give it a shot. Um, you mentioned a lot of descriptions as to actual reasons behind reincarnation, why people believe in it, and um, and so forth. A few of them were the lack of dopamine, the excitation thing, and believing in superstition. Um, I can see that. I can see that being true to some degree, but I mean, even in my personal experience, it's not really an excitation. It's just sort of. It usually happens when you're very relaxed and open to it. I mean, I'm sure there are counter cases where people are digging for meaning in their lives, and they're getting excited trying to search for, oh, what's the connection to this, and now what's the connection to that. And then, yeah, sure, I mean, your description is, I mean, by all reasonable standards, at least partially correct. Uh, but I think with any kind of spiritual phenomenon, there are going to be cases that are describable entirely physically without the need for um, anything more, without the need for saying, look, we don't understand this yet. There are some cases like that. And especially the more dogmatic and superstitious forms of spirituality, which may or may not have some kind of inkling to uh, some kind of greater connection, which may be authentic, but they're kind of deeply rooted in superstition and culture and belief systems and groupthink. Religious fundamentalism, no matter where you go, is a very good example of that. They don't seem to derive the same sort of meaning that other people do from uh, their spiritual experiences, even if they're from the same religion. So, I mean, this is a very complicated subject. If you want to go into the details as to the particular religions and what they believe in and all that, but yeah, it's I mean, basically William James just couldn't have said it better when he called his book "The Varieties of Spiritual Experience." Um, but yeah, I don't think it's entirely getting excited about things. It is usually a spontaneous event. Um, at least in the descriptions that I've read, they usually accompany a certain degree of spiritual development. Not usually at the beginning, but usually after years of practice, or people who just um, are sort of naturally inclined towards spiritual. I guess you could say, I wouldn't call them spiritual geniuses, but people who are naturally doing things that other people really try hard to do. And by that I mean the quiet mind, remaining simple and open, not getting lost in any kind of particular emotion, very much more balanced and I guess you could say pure within. And I mean, some people do have a natural disposition for that, and that may be genetic and maybe related to other things. But even those people seem to have some kind of inclination towards this. It's difficult to explain or well, like the thing with this sort of I guess experience is that it is very directly experiential, and unless it's happened to you, I mean, it could sound silly, or it could even just sound downright implausible. But I mean, direct experience of this sort of feeling, it's usually a very calming thing. It's very opening up. I don't know, and I don't know if that necessarily correlates or not with excitation, with paranoia, because what you're describing, I've also heard. I've heard people who get very into looking for meaning. I've heard people who get very into um, talking about karma and past and retribution from the past and things like that. I feel like those things are superficial at the level that you're describing. That we can say, like, look, if you say that if this person's having a rough life and you tell them, look, whatever you're getting right now, it must have been because you killed like 20 people probably or something in your past life, and now you're redeeming. Yeah, that's a huge burden, and I don't necessarily agree with doing that or even thinking in that way. Um, so I guess what would be good to do right now is to distinguish between the more superstitious and dogmatic forms of any form of religion, reincarnation being an aspect that's included in this, has different levels to it, I guess you could say, of how you look at it, different attitudes. And yes, there's an attitude where you can see things as black and white, good and bad. Good actions and bad actions will determine your fate. That can be a very paranoid state of being, really. But I guess as a counter to that, but not even really a counter, but just an alternative, something underneath that sort of mode of thinking is a very spontaneous, open, sort of natural state of experience where it's not that we're searching for these things and looking for meaning. It's just sort of, it just comes about easily. I mean, it's the sort of stuff you pick up not unnaturally. And even upon introspection, it's like, oh, well, I didn't feel excited today. I'm not really looking for patterns, it's just something I noticed. Of course, somebody who's entirely enthralled in looking for patterns, then I would say maybe you should take another look at what you're doing. Maybe you're doing something subconsciously. So you're right about checking all of these things first, because if you don't do that, of course, you can fall into the trap of just sort of believing this stuff without really critically thinking about it. But otherwise, I guess we can distinguish between the superstitious exterior. I mean, they used to call this. I think Ken Wilber calls this two types of religious experience in religion, very broadly, exoteric and esoteric. And some people would have you believe that well, first off, exoteric is very literal translations, very simplistic modes of morality. Basically, the what you're describing, and it's very common in religion and religious organizations in particular. But that's not the only thing that religions have to offer. They also have esoteric, and of course, the esoteric is a much more deeper, mystical sort of meaning that is often more experiential than the exoteric, which is just judging the environment and making up assumptions or superstitions about the environment. Esoteric often tends to be directly experiential, where you're not just feeling connections. It is really a sense of just this other sort of greater underlying force, but it's not that it's. I mean, I don't know if you could really call that superstitious, or it's not necessarily provable by empirical means, but it's not necessarily untrue or unfounded, because often what accompanies it is it's a very evolved sense of self and identity in relation to other. The esoteric practice tends to be much deeper and much more compatible with not having superstition, for criticizing people for not thinking critically. There's a lot more pragmatism to it, but at the same sense, since there are apparently other things that they intuit naturally, they do make claims that sound perhaps shrouded in a little bit of lingo. They do. I mean, they are esoteric. They do seem to be shrouded in that, but at the same time, they're grounded in experience, which in and of itself is something to look into and examine. The downside, of course, is that if it's too shrouded in just saying, "Well, I've experienced this directly. I don't know what to tell you." I mean, that it may not be a good way to explain things, but for looking for the more esoteric sort of practice, I think Zen would be a good place to start. In the book Three Pillars of Zen, there's a couple interesting descriptions of reincarnation, and they're very unique, so to speak, and I definitely recommend checking them out. And I guess that's it for this video. Thanks for your reply, and thanks for listening.